The contract stated my official job title was Winter Season Equipment Technician for a decommissioned research outpost in the Alaskan wilderness. The pay was $50,000 for 3 months of isolation, deposited halfway up front. I didn't ask why the last 3 technicians broke contract and left within weeks, forfeiting their bonus. I was drowning in debt and desperation, and the silence of the Arctic sounded like salvation. But when the final helicopter left and the 60-mile-an-hour winds began to howl, I found a locked briefcase under the floorboards of my quarters. It contained the real operational logs. I wasn't hired to fix generators. I was hired to occupy the thing they kept buried beneath the ice. The helicopter ride to Outpost Sierra was a 2-hour journey into a white void. Below us, the sprawling Alaskan tundra was a frozen ocean of pine and jagged rock, beautiful and utterly terrifying in its vastness. The pilot, a grim man named Sullivan, who worked for the private contractor that hired me, barely spoke over the roar of the rotors. He just chewed gum and watched the horizon with narrow eyes. We touched down on a steel landing pad vibrating in the bitter wind, the metal groaning under the strain of the elements. Outpost Sierra looked like a cluster of metal shipping containers welded together and half buried in the snow, a forgotten monument to human stubbornness in an inhospitable land. A massive radar dish tilted precariously on the roof, groaning in the gale like a dying animal. It looked abandoned, forgotten by time and man. "You have supplies for 90 days, Sullivan shouted over the dying engine, handing me a heavy ring of keys that felt icy even through my gloves. "The generator is self-sustaining but needs daily checks. Don't miss a check. The cold up here kills faster than you think." I nodded, grabbing my duffel bag, feeling the weight of his words settle in my gut. The cold air hit my lungs like ground glass, instantly freezing the moisture in my nose. I watched the helicopter lift off, a tiny speck vanishing into the gray sky, and felt the crushing weight of true isolation settle onto my shoulders, a physical burden I wasn't prepared for. The interior of the outpost was utilitarian and metallic, smelling of stale coffee, diesel fuel, and old sweat that had seeped into the walls over decades of use. My living quarters were a small room near the center of the complex, insulated against the howling wind outside, but still holding a pervasive chill. Before Sullivan left, he had taped a laminated sheet of paper to the metal door of the main corridor. It was a list of rules, strangely specific for a simple maintenance job, written in bold, blocky letters. Rule 1. Perimeter checks must be completed before 1600 hours. Do not go outside past dusk, as visibility drops to 0 and the temperature becomes instantly lethal. Rule 2. Keep the floodlights on the south side active at all times during darkness to illuminate the generator access. Rule 3. Do not enter Sector 4, the basement level. The structural integrity is compromised and the area is deemed unsafe for personnel. Rule 4. If you hear knocking on the outer hull, do not investigate. The metal contracts in the cold, creating loud noises. I laughed when I first read them, thinking they were absurd. They sounded like something from a campfire spooky story meant to haze the new guy and provide some entertainment for the pilot on his flight back. I figured Sullivan was just trying to scare me to keep me alert and focused on the job. I threw my gear on the cot, happy to be alone with the easy money, dreaming of the debts I would pay off. I was a fool, blinded by desperation and greed. The silence of the Arctic night was heavier than anything I had ever experienced in my life, a suffocating blanket of nothingness. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was an expectant, predatory silence that made the hairs on my arms stand up. The wind died down around midnight, and the outpost became a metal tomb, amplifying the sound of my own breathing. I lay on my cot, staring at the rivets in the ceiling, unable to sleep despite the exhaustion of travel, my mind racing with the strange rule Sullivan had left. Around 200 hours, I heard the sound, faint at first, but growing in intensity. It started as a low vibration that I felt in my teeth before I heard it with my ears, a deep resonance that seemed to come from the very foundations of the outpost. It was a deep, resonant thrumming coming from beneath the metal floor plates, vibrating through the cot frame. It sounded industrial, like a massive machine cycling up deep underground. But then it changed dramatically. It shifted into a guttural, wet sound, like an enormous lung exhaling slowly, a sound that belonged to no machine ever built. It lasted for 10 seconds, then faded back into silence, leaving a ringing in my ears. I sat up, heart hammering against my ribs, sweat beading on my forehead despite the cold. I told myself it was just the geothermal heating pipes settling in the permafrost, trying to rationalize the irrational. Buildings make noise, especially old metal ones in extreme cold. But deep down in the pit of my stomach, a primal instinct disagreed violently. That sound didn't come from a machine. It came from a throat. And it was close. The next morning, the sun was a pale, heatless disk hanging low in the sky, offering no warmth against the biting cold. I suited up in full Arctic gear, layering clothing until I felt like a stuffed sausage to do my required generator check in the external shed. The air was 50 degrees below zero, instantly freezing the moisture in my nose and coating my beard in frost within seconds of stepping outside. The snow around the compound was pristine and undisturbed, a perfect white blanket shielding the frozen earth, blindingly bright in the weak sunlight. I walked around to the south side of the main building, trudging through knee-deep drifts to check the floodlights as instructed by Rule 2. That's when I saw it, and my blood ran cold, colder than the air around me. The reinforced steel siding of the outpost, thick enough to stop small arms fire and withstand hurricane-force winds, was scarred deeply. 3 parallel gouges ran diagonally across a 10-foot section of the wall, tearing through the paint and into the metal itself. The metal was peeled back like the foil wrapper on a chocolate bar, the edges jagged and sharp. The grooves were deep, jagged, and taller than I was, starting near the roofline and ending near the ground. I placed my gloved hand near them for scale, my hand looking ridiculously small next to the massive marks. Whatever made these marks had claws the size of butcher's knives and strength that defied belief, strength that belonged to no known animal. A polar bear was strong, but a polar bear couldn't shear through military-grade steel like it was paper. I retreated back inside the outpost as fast as my bulky gear allowed, slamming and locking the heavy pressure door with trembling hands, my heart pounding in my chest. The sense of security I felt inside the metal walls was evaporating fast, replaced by a gnawing dread that sat heavy in my stomach. I tried to distract myself by organizing the supply pantry, counting cans of beans and bags of rice, but the image of those claw marks burned in my mind, a constant reminder of the danger outside. By that afternoon, a new element was added to the growing nightmare, assaulting another one of my senses. The ventilation system, which pulled air from outside through heavy filters to keep the interior breathable, began to pump a strange odor into the complex. It wasn't the smell of diesel or ozone, the usual sense of the outpost. It was thick, musky, and primal, a scent that triggered an instinctual fear response. It smelled like wet, matted fur, copper-tinged blood, and the raw ammonia scent of a large predator's den, concentrated and overwhelming. It was so overpowering that I gagged, covering my nose and mouth with my sleeve. I turned the ventilation fans off, preferring the stale, recycled air to that horrifying scent coming from outside. The smell triggered something deep in my brain, a genetic memory of being prey in the Dark Ages, hiding in a cave from something bigger and faster. I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that something massive was circling the outpost, testing the air, scenting the inside this metal can, waiting for an opportunity. 3 days into my shift, the weather turned violently, as if the Arctic itself was trying to kill me. A massive Arctic cyclone slammed into the region, bringing winds that screamed like banshees and dropped visibility to zero, turning the world outside into a swirling white void. Snow piled up against the windows in drifts 10 feet high, burying the outpost and cutting off any view of the outside world. I was completely trapped, sealed inside a metal box buried in the snow. The satellite radio, my only link to the outside world and a voice of sanity, dissolved into static and then went dead entirely. The storm should have been terrifying on its own, with the constant howling wind and the bone-chilling cold creeping in around the seals, but it was what the storm covered up that scared me more. The howling wind masked other sounds, sounds that I was desperate to hear so I could prepare. I'd be sitting in the mess hall trying to read a book to calm my nerves, and I would feel heavy rhythmic thuds vibrating through the walls, like something heavy impacting the hull, testing its strength.
The lights would flicker with each impact, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to move on their own. It felt like a siege, a slow, deliberate wearing down of my defenses. I spent my time checking the locks on the doors every hour, armed with a heavy fire axe I found in the emergency locker, clutching it like a lifeline. It felt ridiculously inadequate against whatever was out there. The sense of isolation was absolute, a physical weight pressing down on me. There was no help coming, no one to call. I was alone at the top of the world with something that wanted in, something that was patient and strong.
Boredom and fear are a dangerous combination, leading the mind down dark paths. On the 5th day of the storm, desperate for something to do besides stare at the walls and listen to the wind howl, I decided to investigate the previous occupant's room. It was a small cabin next to mine, left exactly as it had been when the last technician fled, with clothes still folded on the shelf and a half-read book on the nightstand. Underneath a loose metal floor plate near the cot, I found a leather briefcase covered in dust. It was locked, but a little work with a screwdriver popped the cheap latch, revealing its contents. Inside weren't personal effects or money, as I had half expected. It was packed with manila folders, stamped with red, classified ink, and the logo of the company that hired me, Borealis Solutions, a logo that now seemed sinister. I pulled out the first file, my hands shaking slightly. It was dated from the 1980s, the paper yellowed and brittle. The photos inside weren't of weather equipment or geological surveys. They were blurry, grainy pictures of a massive excavation site in the ice, surrounded by armed soldiers in cold weather gear. In the center of the pit, partially thawed from a glacier and surrounded by scientific equipment, was a huge, dark shape. It looked hunched and vaguely humanoid, but impossibly large, its features obscured by ice and shadow. I sat on the floor of the small cabin and read for hours, my blood turning to ice as the truth unfolded before me. The outpost wasn't a weather station. It had never been a weather station. That was just a cover story for the public and the gullible technicians they hired. It was a containment facility built during the Cold War over the site of a discovery named Project Fenris, a project so secret it didn't officially exist. The files detailed how a Soviet mining team looking for uranium had uncovered a creature frozen in the permafrost for thousands of years, perfectly preserved in the ice. The creature wasn't dead, it was in a state of suspended animation, a deep hibernation that had lasted for millennia. The company, Borealis Solutions, a shadowy private contractor with deep pockets, had acquired the site after the Soviet Union fell, buying the secrets along with the land. The reports described the creature as an apex predator from a forgotten age, a biological anomaly that resembled ancient myths of lycanthropy, a wolf were, but far larger and deadlier than any legend. But this was no myth, no story to scare children. The scientific data on its muscle density, regenerative capabilities, and aggression were terrifyingly real, detailing experiments and observations that turned my stomach. The outpost was built to study it in secrecy, and more importantly, to keep it contained in the frozen sublevels, far from civilization. The storm outside roared, shaking the walls of the outpost, but all I could hear was the beating of my own heart as I realized what was sleeping beneath my feet, what I had been hired to guard. The final folder in the briefcase was the most recent, dated just a few weeks before my arrival. It contained my own employment contract, the one I had signed with such relief, thinking it was my ticket out of debt. But attached to it was an internal memo I was never meant to see, a document that sealed my fate. The subject line read, "Winter Containment Protocol, Asset Management," a chillingly bureaucratic title for what it contained. I read the memo, my hands shaking so hard I nearly dropped the paper,
my eyes widening in horror with each sentence. The creature in the ice, Subject Alpha, had begun waking up more frequently due to rising global temperatures melting the permafrost around its cage. It was becoming active, restless, and trying to breach containment, testing the bars and the electrical systems designed to hold it. The memo stated that automated systems were failing to keep it sedated, that the tranquilizers were becoming less effective. Then I read the sentence that stopped my breath, the sentence that condemned me. Manual distraction required. Deploy Class D personnel, technician, to occupy Subject Alpha's attention during peak activity months. Expenditure of asset is acceptable to maintain containment integrity. I wasn't a technician, not in their eyes. I was Class D personnel, expendable. I was live bait sent here to keep a monster busy so it wouldn't break out and head towards civilization, to be sacrificed on the altar of containment. The realization hit me like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of me. The high pay, the quick hiring process, the bizarre rules about the basement, Sullivan's grim silence, it all made sickening sense now. Sullivan knew. They all knew what they were sending me into. I was never expected to survive the 3 months, never meant to collect that bonus. I was just supposed to last long enough for the winter to pass and the creature to go back into hibernation, a human chew toy to keep it occupied. As if on cue, acknowledging my realization, the sound returned, louder and more terrifying than before. It wasn't the low thrumming, the sound of it waking up. It was a full-throated howl that cut through the noise of the storm outside, a sound that spoke of ancient hunger and endless rage. It was horrifyingly close, not underground anymore. It sounded right outside the main blast door, separated from me by only a few inches of steel. The metal walls of the outpost vibrated with the sheer power of the sound, rattling the tools on the shelves. It was a challenge, a declaration of hunger and rage, a signal that the hunt had begun. I grabbed the fire axe, my knuckles white, and backed into the corner of the mess hall, eyes fixed on the door, waiting for the inevitable. The storm had buried us, but it had also given the creature a bridge to the upper levels, a path to its prey. The attack began at 0300 hours, precisely when the storm was at its peak. The lights in the outpost suddenly died, plunging me into total darkness, save for the red emergency backup lights pulsing along the floor, casting eerie, dancing shadows. The silence that followed the power outage was broken almost immediately by the sound of tearing metal from the south side of the complex, near the generator room, the heart of the outpost. I heard the heavy, wet crunch of the outer airlock door being ripped off its hinges, metal screaming in protest as it was violated. The storm shrieked into the breach, bringing snow and freezing air into the corridors, instantly dropping the temperature inside. Then I heard it, the sound I had been dreading. Heavy, padding footsteps on the metal grating of the hallway floor. Thump, thump, thump. They were slow, deliberate, and terrifyingly heavy, shaking the floor with each step. It was inside, in the same space as me. I scrambled backward down the hallway, slipping on the frosty metal, heading for the comms room, hoping against hope that I could get the radio working, to scream at someone, anyone, about what they had done to me, to leave a record of my fate before the end. I reached the comms room, lungs burning from the cold air, slammed the heavy door shut, just as something massive slammed against it from the other side, with the force of a battering ram. The metal walls groaned and buckled inward under the impact, the paint flaking off and showering onto the floor. I fell backward, dropping the axe in my panic, scrambling away from the door on my hands and knees. Through the small reinforced glass porthole in the door, I saw it in the pulsing red emergency light, a nightmare brought to life. It was huge, easily 8 feet tall, hunched over in the hallway because its shoulders were too broad for the confined space. It was covered in thick, matted, gray-black fur that looked oily and coarse, stained with ice and dirt. Its arms were disproportionately long, ending in hands with massive black claws that gripped the doorframe, gouging the steel with ease. But it was the face that froze me with terror. It was a grotesque, elongated wolf snout, pulling back to reveal rows of yellow fangs, but the eyes were intelligent, horribly so. They glowed with a sickly amber light, staring at me right with pure, ancient malice, analyzing me, savoring my fear. It knew I was there, and it knew I was trapped.
It didn't try to break the door down again immediately, though I knew it could have. It knew I was trapped, with nowhere to run. It huffed against the glass, fogging it with hot, stinking breath that smelled of raw meat and decay, then turned and loped away down the dark corridor with a terrifying grace for something so large. I heard it moving through the outpost, smashing equipment, tearing open supply lockers, destroying everything in its path. It was hunting, exploring its new territory, marking it with its scent and its violence. I was trapped in the comms room, a dead end with no other exit. I knew it was only playing with me, savoring the fear before the kill, like a cat with a mouse. I looked at the radio console, my last hope. It was dead, smashed into pieces during the initial power surge that the creature had somehow caused. I was completely cut off from the outside world, alone in the dark with a monster. My only weapon was a fire axe against a creature that could tear through steel plating like it was cardboard. I needed a plan, a way out. But the only way out of the outpost was past that thing, through the corridors it was currently prowling. I remembered Rule 3. Do not enter Sector 4, the basement level. The files said that was where the containment unit was. Maybe there was something down there that could help me, or maybe it was just a deeper grave, a place to die where no one would ever find me. I waited until the sounds of the creature moved to the far side of the complex, toward the sleeping quarters where it was likely tearing my room apart. I slowly unlocked the comms room door, wincing at the screech of the metal, and slipped into the dark hallway, the axe gripped tight in sweating hands, ready to swing at any shadow. The air was freezing now, the breach let the Arctic winter inside, and snow was beginning to drift in the hallways. I moved silently toward the central stairwell that led down to Sector 4, trying to keep my breathing quiet. The heavy metal door to the stairs was padlocked from the outside, marked with danger signs and warnings in multiple languages. I used the axe to smash the padlock off, the loud clang echoing dangerously in the metal halls, sounding like a dinner bell for the monster. I held my breath, waiting for the roar, for the sound of charging feet, but it didn't come. I pulled the door open, the hinges groaning, and descended into the darkness below, the beam of my small flashlight cutting through the gloom. The air got colder the deeper I went, smelling ancient and musty, like earth that hadn't seen the sun in millennia, mixed with the faint metallic scent of old blood. The stairs ended at a heavy blast door that was slightly ajar, propped open by a piece of debris. I slipped through the gap in the blast door, my heart pounding in my ears. Sector 4 wasn't a basement. It was a massive cavern carved out of the glacial ice, reinforced with steel beams and concrete that looked precariously placed. In the center of the cavern was a colossal containment pit, 50 feet deep and 100 feet across, surrounded by thick titanium bars and high-voltage electrical emitters that were currently dead and silent. The pit was empty, a gaping maw in the ice. The massive steel gate at the bottom, thick enough to stop a tank, was torn open from the inside out, the metal twisted and rent like fabric. Giant, jagged claw marks scored the concrete floor, leading away from the pit toward the stairs that I had just descended, showing the path the creature had taken. The creature hadn't broken in from the storm, as I had initially thought. It had broken out from down here, from its prison in the ice. The storm had just provided noise cover for its escape from the pit, masking the sound of tearing metal, and the power outage had killed the electric fences designed to hold it in.
I realized then that the company hadn't just sent me as bait, they had sent me to be present when the inevitable breakout happened. A warm body to distract it while it got its bearings in the upper levels, a sacrifice to buy them time. I stood in the freezing cavern staring at the empty cage, the realization of my situation sinking in. A plan formed in my terrified mind, born of desperation. It was desperate, insane, and probably suicide, but it was the only chance I had for survival. I couldn't kill the creature. I had seen what it could do to steal, but maybe I could put it back in its cage, trap it where it belonged. The files mentioned that the creature was driven by primal hunger and aggression, especially after waking from hibernation, that it was instinct-driven. It would chase anything that moved, anything that smelled like prey. I looked at the high-voltage emitters around the pit, standing silent sentinels. They were dead because the main generator upstairs was down, destroyed or disabled by the creature. If I could lure the creature back down here into the pit and then somehow restart the generator, the electric grid might activate and trap it again, sealing it back in its icy prison. It meant I had to go back upstairs, into the monster's territory, find it, get it to chase me, lead it down into this ice hell, and then beat it back to the generator room before it figured out the trap or caught me. It was a suicide mission. A desperate gamble with slim odds, but I was already dead anyway if I did nothing. I climbed back up the stairs, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. I reached the main level hallway, peering around the corner. It was quiet again, that terrible silence returning, amplified by the wind outside. I needed to get its attention, to draw it to me. I walked to the center of the hallway, taking a deep breath to steady my nerves, and slammed the flat of the axe against the metal wall 3 times with all my strength. Clang! 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 The sound rang through the metal complex like a dinner bell, echoing down the corridors. I waited, holding my breath, axe raised. 5 seconds passed in agonizing silence. 10. Then, from the direction of the mess hall, I heard a low, grumbling growl that vibrated the floorboards under my feet. Then came the thundering sound of heavy paws sprinting on metal grating, getting louder and closer with terrifying speed. It was coming, and it was angry. I turned and ran back toward the stairs to Sector 4, adrenaline flooding my system, screaming at my legs to move faster than they ever had before, the sound of the approaching monster spurring me on. I dove through the doorway to the stairs just as the creature burst around the corner at the end of the hall, a massive blur of fur and teeth. I caught a glimpse of massive teeth and glowing yellow eyes, filled with predatory rage, before I slammed the door shut behind me. It didn't hold for a second against the creature's momentum. The creature hit the door at full speed, knocking it completely off its hinges with a deafening crash and sending it flying down the stairs ahead of me. I scrambled down the metal steps, half falling, half sliding on the ice that was forming on them, hearing the monster roaring and snarling right behind me. Its claws scraped against the metal walls, sparks flying in the dark, illuminating the stairwell in brief, terrifying flashes. The smell of it, that awful, musty, rotten scent of ancient death, washed over me, choking me, making it hard to breathe. I reached the bottom and burst into the ice cavern, sprinting toward the open containment pit, slipping on the icy floor. I had to time this perfectly or I was dead. I had to get inside the containment area, let it follow me in, and then slip out through the maintenance bars before it caught me and tore me apart.
I ran into the center of the titanium cage area, my lungs burning. The creature pounded into the cavern behind me, skidding on the icy floor, its claws gouging the ice as it tried to stop. It saw me in the cage and roared in triumph, thinking it had me cornered, and lunged through the open gate without hesitation. It was unbelievably fast, covering the distance in a single bound. I dove for the small maintenance gap between 2 of the massive bars, just as the creature's giant paw swiped at me with incredible force. The claws caught the back of my heavy Arctic parka, shredding the tough material like tissue paper and slicing deep into the flesh of my shoulder. I screamed in pain, but managed to squeeze through the gap, tumbling out onto the concrete floor outside the cage, blood staining the snow. The creature slammed against the bars with enough force to shake the entire cavern, its jaws snapping inches from my face, roaring in frustration because it couldn't fit through the small gap I had used. It was trapped inside the perimeter, pacing angrily, but the gate was still open and the power was still off. I had to get back upstairs to the generator room before it figured out it could just walk back out the gate. I didn't look back at the raging monster in the cage. I scrambled to my feet, clutching my bleeding shoulder to staunch the flow of blood, and ran for the stairs, stumbling on the uneven ice. The creature was roaring and thrashing in the cage behind me, trying to figure out how to get back out, its rage echoing off the ice walls. I knew it wouldn't take long for it to realize the main gate was still open and come after me again. I tore up the stairs, ignoring the burning pain in my shoulder and legs, forcing myself to move faster. I reached the main level and turned toward the generator room at the south end of the complex, near where the creature had originally broken in. The snow was blowing into the hallway through the breach, making the floor slick and treacherous. I slipped on a patch of ice and fell hard, sliding several feet down the corridor, knocking the wind out of myself. I heard the creature bellow from below, a sound of pure fury. It was coming back up the stairs, and it was moving fast. I scrambled up, ignoring the pain, and threw myself through the doorway of the generator room, slamming the heavy metal door and spinning the locking wheel just as a massive weight impacted the other side with a deafening crash. The generator room was freezing, almost as cold as outside, the breach in the outer wall letting the blizzard in with full force. The main diesel generator sat silent and cold in the center of the room, a massive block of metal that was my only hope. I worked frantically in the dark, my hands numb and shaking from the cold and fear, trying to prime the fuel pump and engage the starter motor by feel. Outside the door, the creature was going berserk, throwing its entire weight against the metal. It was hammering against the metal, the steel groaning and buckling under the assault, the weld starting to pop. Bang, bang, bang! The hinges started to scream under the strain, threatening to give way any second. I got the primer worked, pumping fuel into the cold engine, and pulled the starter cord with all my remaining strength. Nothing happened. The engine just turned over sluggishly. I pulled again, harder this time. Nothing. The creature roared outside, and I saw the metal of the door begin to tear along the top seam, light from the hallway spilling through the gap. One more pull, I told myself. I put my foot against the engine block for leverage and pulled the cord with everything I had left in me, screaming with the effort. The generator coughed, sputtered, and then roared to life with a deafening clamor, belching black smoke into the freezing room. The emergency lights in the room flared brighter, casting long shadows, and I heard the hum of electrical systems coming back online throughout the outpost, a beautiful sound. Down in Sector 4, the high-voltage system around the containment pit would be engaging, turning the cage into a lethal trap. If the creature was still on the stairs or in the hallway, it wouldn't matter. The trap would be set. But if it had gone back down toward the pit to investigate my scent, I had to know. I grabbed a handful of road flares from an emergency kit on the wall and cracked one open, bathing the room in searing red light and choking smoke. The pounding on the door had stopped the moment the generator started, the sudden noise and vibration seemingly confusing it. The sudden noise and vibration must have confused it or drawn it away from the door to investigate the source of the new sound. I hoped it had gone back downstairs, drawn by the humming of the re-energized grid in its prison. I knew I couldn't stay here in the generator room, even with the power back on. The creature could tear through that door eventually, generator or not, once it got over its confusion. I needed to get out of the outpost completely, put as much distance between me and that thing as possible. The files had mentioned an emergency escape tunnel in the generator room that led to a supply cache about a half-mile away, buried in the snow for just such an emergency. I found the heavy floor hatch in the corner of the room, buried under frozen tarps and crates of tools. I heaved it open with a grunt of effort, revealing a dark, narrow concrete tunnel dropping down into the ice, smelling of stale air and cold. I could hear the creature prowling in the hallway outside again, growling low, having returned to its primary target. It was sniffing loudly under the door, its scent drifting into the room. I didn't hesitate. I dropped into the tunnel and pulled the heavy hatch shut above me, sealing myself in and plunging myself into total darkness and silence, away from the storm and the monster, praying the tunnel was clear. I crawled for what felt like hours through the freezing, cramped tunnel. My knees and elbows scraped raw against the rough concrete. The red flare I had brought with me sputtered and died halfway through, leaving me to navigate by feel in the absolute blackness, the darkness pressing in on me. My shoulder throbbed with a dull, sickening fire from the creature's claws, and I could feel the blood trickling down my back. I was exhausted, dehydrated, and terrified. Every sound in the tunnel made me freeze in panic. Finally, my hands hit a cold metal ladder going up into the darkness. I climbed until my head hit a heavy hatch cover, pushing against it with all my remaining strength. I pushed upward, breaking through a layer of hard-packed snow that had covered the hatch, and tumbled out into the blinding white of the Arctic storm, gasping for air. I was outside, free from the outpost. The supply cache was a small buried container nearby, marked by a pole I almost missed in the blizzard. I dug into it like a madman, finding emergency rations, a first aid kit, and most importantly, a working flare gun and a handheld GPS beacon. I activated the beacon, praying someone was listening, and huddled in the snow, waiting to die from the cold or be found by the thing from the outpost. A Canadian Ranger patrol picked me up 2 days later, half buried in the snow. They saw the beacon signal blip on their screens and came to investigate, expecting a downed plane. I was half dead from hypothermia, frostbite turning my fingers and toes black, my mind wandering from the cold and fear. I told them everything, the outpost, the files, the creature in the ice, the company that sent me there to die. They listened politely, nodding their heads, and then exchanged looks that said I was crazy, just another cabin fever victim out of his mind from isolation in the storm. When I got out of the hospital weeks later, after losing 2 toes and parts of my fingers, I tried to find Borealis solutions to make them pay. They didn't exist. There was no record of them anywhere. The contract I signed, the bank accounts where they deposited the money, the people I spoke to, all ghosts, wiped from existence. The outpost was listed in official records as decommissioned decades ago, a relic of the Cold War. No one believes me, and I've stopped trying to convince them. I live in a city now, surrounded by lights and noise, terrified of silence and the dark, jumping at every shadow. Sometimes when the wind howls between the skyscrapers at night during a winter storm, I can hear that roar again, echoing in my mind. I know it's still up there in the ice, waiting, and I know that somewhere, in some high-rise office, the people who sent me there are looking at a map of the Arctic, planning the next expedition, and looking for new bait to send into the cold.